Welcome to the 21st Ship of the Week. This week we're covering the second Kaiser-class express liner that would serve 3 separate careers during the course of her life, SS Kronprinz Wilhelm. Following the raucous success of their first superliner, Kaiser Wilhelm der Große, which we have already examined, the German merchant shipping giant, Ne Deutscher Lloyd, ordered a sister to be built at the Vulcan shipyard at Stettin, now a major Polish city. Launched in March of 1900, the new ship was 663 feet in length, or 202 meters, and displaced nearly 25,000 tons, ensuring Kronprinz Wilhelm represented a slight size increase compared to her elder sister. Kronprinz entered service in September of 1901, and almost immediately, her deluxe suites and somewhat restrained color schemes compared to the earlier Kaiser-class liner made her enormously popular with the transatlantic elite. Their satisfaction, however, was likely due in large part to her superior speed. The ship's quadruple expansion engines and twin screws developed a top speed of 23 knots. She missed shattering her sister's record on her maiden voyage, however, somewhat as a result of a rogue wave that slammed into her head-on during the Atlantic leg of the crossing between Cherbourg and New York, doing little permanent harm to the ship or anyone aboard her, but certainly impeding her progress. It was not until a year after the start of her career, in September of 1902, that Kronprinz Wilhelm seized the coveted blue ribbon for the Atlantic record on a westbound crossing. The ship's speed, as was common with ocean greyhounds like her, frequently resulted in a sandblaster-like effect on the paint near her prow. Kronprinz Wilhelm also carried on the time-honored ocean liner tradition of running into things throughout her career, sinking the cargo ship SS Robert Ingham near Southampton in a collision, partially damaging the Royal Navy destroyer HMS Wizard near Southampton, and even smashing into a wandering iceberg, although that one was not near Southampton. None of these incidents did much to deter the traveling public that nevertheless flocked to Kronprinz's swift and comfortable service. Later in 1902, Prince Heinrich of Prussia, the Kaiser's brother, was scheduled to make a state visit to the United States to meet President Theodore Roosevelt. Rather than use any imperial vessels or navy ships to transport himself, his entourage, and their accompanying gaggle of press, the prince chartered the imposing Kronprinz Wilhelm for the journey to New York, where they were met with all the pageantry associated with such a gathering, including a state dinner in the ballroom of New York's Astoria Hotel. And indeed, perhaps partly because of her role in the occasion, the Kronprinz Wilhelm then featured on a U.S. postage stamp against the backdrop of the Manhattan skyline. The ship happily ferried people and mail across the Atlantic for more than a decade, until, with ominous rumblings catching alight and bursting into war, the liner was, like so many of her fleetmates, seized by the Imperial German Navy, which undertook a hurried conversion, preparing her for service as an auxiliary cruiser and commerce raider. She was not immediately ready to begin her cruise, though, since the process of making a merchant ship and civilian crew ready for war is not exactly straightforward. She needed to rendezvous with the battle cruiser Karlsruhe in order to take on deck guns and other equipment, itself a dangerous proposition to have 2 large targets stopped and vulnerable to attack. Once preparations were complete, however, she carried on sailing around the South Atlantic, stopping passing merchantmen, boarding them, and should they be deemed a legitimate target, their passengers and crew were transferred by boat to Kronprinz Wilhelm, and the victim was scuttled. In total, between September 1914 and spring 1915, she sank 16 Allied merchant ships. In March, however, a wrench was thrown into her operations following the Royal Navy's capture of her attending supply steamer. The sudden lack of access to fuel and provisions put a finite cap on her range and the time she could remain at sea. Once the situation on board turned increasingly desperate, the crew were reluctantly forced to sail for the United States and the refuge of a neutral harbor. Upon arrival at Newport News, Virginia, Kronprinz Wilhelm's largely successful campaign had come to an end. Her crew were detained at a camp in Norfolk, where they appear to have become quite a popular tourist attraction among Americans. Kronprinz Wilhelm's former lieutenant, Alfred von Nieczowski, for instance, eventually moved to Washington, D.C., his Polish noble ancestry allowing him to meld into the high society of the American capital, as well as travel around telling tales of his experiences during the war. He eventually published a book on the cruise of the Kronprinz Wilhelm. Within hours of the United States declaring war on Germany on April 6, 1917, the U.S. government took control of the Kronprinz. Her crew were moved from the village they had constructed for themselves in Virginia to Fort McPherson in Georgia, where they set about making things to sell and sustain themselves. And the former flagship of the German merchant fleet had a new name, USS von Steuben, after the Prussian military officer that helped lead the Continental Army during the American War for Independence. Originally intended for a similar raider role to that which she served in the German Navy, it was determined she was better suited as a naval transport, and she was ready for sea again by the fall of 1917. It was during this part of her career that her officers sat for the group photo seen here, and pictured alongside other former German Atlantic liners then in service with the U.S. Navy, it was on her first Atlantic crossing as a troopship that she collided with her sister, USS Agamemnon, ex-SS Kaiser Wilhelm II, although both ships continued on their way, unable to stop in the wartime conditions as chaotic damage control efforts were carried out. Neither ship was lost. During the return crossing to the United States, von Steuben was running low on coal and needed to sail into Halifax for bunkering in order to complete the voyage. On the morning of the 6th of December, 1917, she was roughly 40 miles from the city when a sudden blast wave thundered across the water, alarming everyone on board. A brief panic over what was feared to be a torpedo or naval mine was tossed aside as a towering plume of fire and smoke rose into the sky ahead of them. As it turns out, the cargo ship Mont Blanc and her cargo of ammunition, following a collision with the nearby SS Emo, had detonated in one of the largest non-nuclear man-made explosions in history, obliterating much of waterfront Halifax and killing thousands. Upon arriving in the devastated city, von Steuben sent a shore party ashore to assist and remained on station in the harbor for several days, eventually carrying on to Philadelphia. During another crossing to Europe with a complement of troops, a presumed sighting of a periscope sent the ship into battle stations, and during the bedlam, one of her deck guns blew up in the faces of its crew, causing the deaths of 3 men. On a return trip to the U.S. in June of 1918, von Steuben came upon boats in the water from the recently torpedoed SS Vinsk, but immediately suspected that the reason for the boats might still lurk nearby. Sure enough, a torpedo trail appeared, and it was only quick, evasive action by the troopship's captain that prevented a hit. It turns out the culprit was the Spectre U-151, responsible for the destruction of an earlier ship of the week, SS Carolina. Von Steuben was unable to destroy the submarine with depth charges, but the Navy commended the troopship's captain, Sterling, for his actions. Von Steuben was unable to stop, but the Vinsk's boats were picked up later by another passing ship. During a July eastbound crossing, von Steuben came upon the troopship USS Henderson, her forward holds burning furiously. Despite the danger to herself, von Steuben stopped to take aboard the men from the stricken ship. Von Steuben successfully arrived in France, and Henderson, a bit charred, safely sailed for the United States. The last few crossings of the war, what they lacked in submarines and naval mines, they made up for in hurricanes and the 1918 flu pandemic, which steadily worked its way through the ship's complement of soldiers. And on November 11, 1918, the war ended. Von Steuben carried on sailing back and forth, however, but now the bulk of her uniformed passengers were headed in the opposite direction. By late 1919, von Steuben was under the jurisdiction of the United States Shipping Board, the government entity responsible for maritime war prizes, among other things, for which she continued to operate until laid up and scrapped in 1923.